having read Insight and being terribly affected by it, myself and Philip McShane decided to try to write a book that would introduce people to Insight and encourage them to read that, because it's a very, Insight, as you know, I don't know how many pages, but it's over 700 pages, and it's quite dense. So we thought that this might give people a taste of it, well, not simply being descriptive, but asking people to actually see it as an exercise book, because that's what Insight is. But the trouble is, when we read books, very understandably, we read them to get information, and we expect to be at the level of that information, whereas Insight is precisely not. It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be something that you work at to try to find out in yourself, because it's talking about yourself. And that's why we call the book Self-Meaning. It's to find out what you're doing when you're carrying out a perfectly ordinary question at various levels. It's not to be read like an ordinary book for information that you're up to. It's really to be read so that you will understand what you're doing more clearly.
Yeah.
It isn't that it's going to teach you to do it. We do actually ask questions, come to theories, and make judgments about them. So it's not saying that you do this is surprising, nor is it saying that you are simply to read that somebody wrote about it. It's that to clarify yourself, and that means each person, about what it is you're doing when you're asking a question, making a suggestion or a hypothesis, and coming to a conclusion. We can know how we think and how we judge only by studying ourselves, knowing and judging. Well, we hoped it would be for any adult who was prepared to take the time, and who would say, we thought it was introductory. We didn't mean that it was necessarily easy to read, but we meant that the ordinary educated adult, and by educated I don't mean formally educated, it could be educated in any kind of way, but had grown up as an adult, had thought about things, and was prepared to read the book slowly, would understand it. And I think what we were trying to do in Towards Self-Meaning, we were trying initially, and what Lonergan is trying to do, or does, I would say, to read it, to raise a question, which I think many people could say, no, I'm not interested in that. That doesn't interest me. Why do you want to know this? Because one reason, I think, would be if somebody realizes, I am making judgments. Why are my judgments correct? What reason do I give myself for relying on this judgment? And then we realize there are some judgments we don't rely on. They're provisional. And I think it's quite startling when you realize that you don't know, you know in practice why you judge this way, but you haven't clarified for yourself how you have moved from the question to the conclusion. You haven't noticed it. You've just done it because it is spontaneous. And people might well say, I'm not interested in that. And there's nothing other than saying, what, you're not, and that's that. I got to Lonergan, in fact, it was Philip McShane introduced me to him. One day, we were both Jesuits at the time, and I am younger than he, and he gave me the problem of Euclid, the two circles, and he said, go and have a look at that. So I went back to my room and I looked at it, and he wanted me to prove that not what the theorem was, but to prove that the circles intersected. And I'd always liked geometry in school. I wasn't enormously good at it or anything, but it was the mathematics that I liked most. And I tried, so I was interested enough in trying. I had enough knowledge to try, and I realized I couldn't. And I only then realized that, in fact, neither could a lot of geometers for centuries. Indeed, it hadn't been noticed. And you could see why it hadn't been noticed, because it was visually obvious. And yet the reality, in a sense, the geometric reality, had not been reached until, I think it was the 1930s, but I'm not certain of that. So it's then I began to realize that when you begin to have an idea about knowing, the first idea that you have is that it's seeing. Saying what is the case is simply saying what you see. And because, of course, it's often right enough. I mean, if I say, look, this is a red diary, and I open and say, oh yeah, it's a diary, well, that's correct. It's not a difficult problem, because everybody knows what a diary is in our common sense. You might go to, going back to the Australian Aborigines who did not have diaries, they might say, well, what do you mean it's a diary? As far as I'm concerned, it's a red book with white pages and lines. And then you say, yes, well, why do I think it's a diary? And you realize that's a common sense thing. But it's correct. It is a diary. Now, but your theory, your idea of it is you see it as a diary. Or you see a diary, but what you see literally is read with, you see exactly the same thing as the Australian Aborigine sees, only his background is different from yours. But we are immediately inclined to think that to know is to see properly. And then there's another, as it were, a theory about knowledge, is that we can make judgments about things, but we can never be at all sure. This is just our way of looking at it, in a way. So it's a kind of idealism or a relativism. And now this is the passage I wanted to read from Lonergan. One escapes only from this through the discovery, and one has not made it yet if one has no clear memory of its startling strangenesses, that there are two quite different realisms. There is an incoherent realism, half animal and half human, that poses as a halfway house between materialism and idealism. And on the other hand, there is an intelligent and reasonable realism between which materialism and idealism, between which and materialism, the halfway house is idealism. And that's it's a more complicated sentence than I think can be properly understood without reading the whole introduction. But it is the crucial thing is to grasp the fact that the real is what you correctly understand. Now, this is where Lonergan says is a crucial part of understanding yourself, not understanding the book, understanding what you do. And he has it, I think I'll find it very quickly, that when you reach this idea that reality is what you reach at the end of an inquiry, not at the beginning. That's a startling, he thinks, a startling idea about your own inquiry, your own understanding. It's an understanding of how you understand. No, my background is philosophy, and then I went to do anthropology. And of course that was also very interesting because two things happened. I did anthropology with a group of Australian Aborigines called Ngathajarra in the Western Desert, and it was tremendously interesting because, of course, for everyday things, their common sense was exactly the same as mine. If we went out as we did, sometimes because the men hunted kangaroo, the women collected nuts and berries and berries and seeds, and indeed most of the food traditionally was gathered by women. It was just that to realize that here was a very different understanding of the world, and that again sparked my continued interest. But of course, this book, Towards Self-Meaning, was written before I went to Australia. So, it doesn't influence this book. It influenced my later thinking and feeling towards things. And the question: what were anthropologists trying to do? They weren't simply trying to experience, to translate, as it were. They were also trying to understand how the other people understood. So we've taken, in trying to teach people to take account of what are you trying to understand. But what we're trying to understand in this book, Towards Self-Meaning, or in Insight, is we're trying to understand what understanding is. What we spontaneously do, what do we say about it? So you see the three movements is: I ask a question about what I can see or hear, and then I come up with a solution, and I test the solution. Now, when I test the solution and say I'm right, that is, I have reached the real, what is really the case, if I happen to be right. But of course, you can also be wrong, can't you? And you might be too easily persuaded. So that means that when we come to understanding and then a judgment, we've got the three phases: the experience, what I'm asking about; the understanding, what I think is the solution; the judgment that it is the solution. But the judgment might be incorrect. So that means that in principle we are moving towards the truth, but we know it only because we have what seems to us to be enough evidence. And if you read the Meno, you'll find most people will be persuaded. But you can be persuaded by a mistake, that what is real is what you judge to be real. But your judgment must be correct. So you're moving towards the real. The real, in a sense, is not given. The real is the objective which you may reach, and which, in many cases, you have very good and sufficient reason. And sufficient reason means it convinces me. And somebody else might say to you, well, I think that is not sufficient reason, and this is why. And then you might say, oh, I hadn't thought of that. You're right, I'll have to go back and see. The person is not saying you're wrong. The person is saying the reason that you give for this conclusion is insufficient. And an honest inquirer will say, yes, you're right, I do see that it's insufficient, therefore I will try again. If you ask people, what do you think is a moral action? What is your example of a moral action? For example, for me now, a moral action is the one that is most that we are involved in this evening is in each case the judgment and the decision to come here. Now people will often think that's not a moral action.
Because they're thinking moralistic.
Yes, right and wrong.
Yeah, and I think that it is the moral question is simply, what shall I do now? And the question then about morality is, what is involved in that question? Because you come up with a solution. I'll come, like you kindly asked me to come about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think, and I said I would. Now, that was a moral question for me. Suddenly Connell sent me a question, which is, as I understand it, a moral question, because it asks me
what aspect of that is moral to you?
That I have to decide what to do.
Conduct.
So, and is the moral part of it your decision to come to court, or is it the commitment you make to Connell to come to court?
Well, the commitment I make to Connell involves, because otherwise it wouldn't be, that I would come unless something
So is it both?
It's both.
So if I go out and get into my car and go on the phone, that's one particular moral
it's an answer to
as opposed to maybe doing something else.
Yeah, exactly. So
choices.
It's choice. So every choice is moral. Very often our choices are pretty routine, and so
we don't use the idea they're moral.
They're moral
because they're so.
I suppose, does everybody here eat breakfast?
Sort of, yeah.
Sort of, yeah.
Is that a moral choice?
Yes, but it's.
Is it because we eat breakfast, or?
No, because it is something that we can choose to do.
Okay.
But
can I put in some, just interject some here that I think might be sticking us. Because things, and I'm going to be pejorative in my terminology, because things are so mundane, routine, habitual, common, it might seem putting a very big label on it to say it's a moral question. It's a moral matter, it's a conduct issue.
Yeah.
That's not the point at all. I mean, in fact, the danger runs the other way. Because we're so, we say, we make moral or choices so unawares, then when it comes to what we consider the big things, we kind of miss it. And we do it the same way. Hence how we form opinions, say.
Yeah, exactly.
But like it might sound, I don't know if I'm being presumptuous here now, but it might sound like when Garrett says it's a moral thing and all, but you know, eating breakfast, but it's a choice. It's a value. There's a whole lot of values involved, like for example, to do with nutrition, well-being, minding yourself. There's all sorts of ramifications, except we tend to do it with so much unawareness that when we're faced with what we would then might consider important choices to change the world, we flow in the same way to them.
So is this an assertion we're making, that if moral choices, we're not aware of moral questions and moral choices we make at the most simple level, what time will I get out of bed and how everything flows from there, if we're not actually aware of ourselves making choices, making moral choices, that when it comes to the difficult stuff, your point, that we haven't developed the method.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Right.
And I mean, obviously, some choices I think are more important than other choices. But for example,
but that's the different thing, you see. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Because some are kind of trivial and some are important, we think there's categorically a difference between them.
There isn't categorically.
There isn't, no.
Yeah. That's really key, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because that's
And we have been brought up, I think, in the West generally, to think that somehow moral choices have to do with religion
And all this, And this is why Keynes
in this country,
and as you know, Gav, this is why Keynes always maintained economics was a moral science. It was a science of conduct.
Yes. And a science in which people are making choices all the time.
Exactly, yeah.
Lonergan is asking, but what is common sense like? What is it doing? It still has questions for understanding and so on, but it's not making a theory. it's a provisional understanding of the world you're living in.
Common sense.
Common sense.
Right, yeah.
It's a provisional understanding and a provisional judgment. You realise it can change.
So when you talked about common sense and provisional knowledge, the creation of provisional knowledge as part of that, you hint at this, which is incredible really. You hint at technology, you hint at newspapers, you hint at cities, you hint at conventional life as it was emerging then. And obviously, in one of Connell's questions, it's taken off into a whole different realm since then. So my question is about if that provisional knowledge is not being questioned, is not being created, but actually is being understood as facts. Our media, our social media, all those sources which are informing contemporary culture.
Yes.
So there is no understanding out there of provisional knowledge, and that it purely is provisional knowledge which is changing. There's an ebb and a flow with it through questioning. That has changed form. Is a question that I wondered about from what you were saying.
Well, I think, as I understand you, I do totally agree that within the realm of common sense, there is still the structure of asking a question and coming up with a suggested solution and a judgment about the solution. Yes. One of the things about Lonergan is that you have to go back to say, what is he actually talking about? And you've got to say, he's talking about doing something. Like when he's talking about higher viewpoints or mathematics, he is talking about something that you do. So in order to understand it, you have to do a little bit of it.
Yes.
And it's so easy, because so much that we read an awful lot. And we expect to understand almost immediately everything.
I suppose my concern is that it's all been, we're moving, and I just wondered what you were picking up in the 60s that we're certainly living with now. I think
like what was this work doing?
Yeah, that kind of hinted at this idea that common sense now is the way, and what I loved is the way you provisional. I think provision is a wonderful word. Provisional knowledge, provisional understanding, provisional judgment. Because just like we've had our conversation here about DUP and Conservatives, that might change tomorrow with more information. Because mostly common sense, we don't have context, and more reflection. So there's a lovely movement in an ebb and a flow, and I think lack of that is impacting our society.
Yes, a feeling that there's a certainty where there isn't one.
Exactly. Exactly. And particularly young people are being fed a diet of facts.
Yes.
That they now think, and as they go forward now into their 20s, 30s, 40s, what effect will that have on their thinking? Whereas at least I think before this we didn't know what we didn't know, and somehow everybody kind of was happy enough with that. But now there's a huge need for certainty.
And there's a huge need, I think, for facts. So people, I think, Colin might disagree with this, and we both tried not to have it in teaching. But so often it was people wanted to come and look, give me the facts. I write these down and I learn these off, and that's it. And the sense of this is actually difficult, you mightn't understand it. There was a resistance, a resentment almost. Did you find that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember once, I won't go into detours too much, but David and I doing postgrad thing on Keynes.
Oh yes.
And a lady who's now, senior lecturer in Maynooth, David and I were stuck on a comma on a page.
Oh right. Yeah.
And after about 3 weeks being stuck, she blew up and she said, "But ye should know your teachers."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we start with common sense, how we live our lives, right?
Yes.
I think most people would be surprised that the idea that methodology surrounds.
Yeah, but I think one might get the impression, perhaps we gave it, that methodology is, as it were, absolutely crucial to a person living their ordinary life. And it clearly is not absolutely crucial, because people live their ordinary lives perfectly well.
But you're saying it's a form of science, what you call introspective methodology or whatever. it's a form of science beyond science, in a sense. It's a meta-science, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's asking the question, what are we doing when we are living our ordinary lives? How are we understanding things?
But also, what are we doing when we do
science? What are we doing
science?
when we do science?
As we mean it.
As we mean it.
All right.
What are we doing when we're doing mathematics?
Right. When you were doing this, Garrett, had you ever, in 69 now, or 67 when you were writing on, had you heard the term first-person science?
No.
Right. No, I think that's right. That's come along in the last 10 or 15 years. And that's really what you're doing. When you say, like, the science of introspective methodology, that would now be called first-person science. It's not a huge field, but it's a growing field. Like, you have third-person science is the guy in the science laboratory studying bugs.
Yeah.
So there's no relationship between the bugs and the person in that sense. And second-person science is people talking to other people, like might be interviewing.
Yes.
And then first-person science is where you are conducting an experiment on yourself in a way. You're examining yourself. So you're the subject of the research and you're the researcher.
It's a first-person science in the sense that the subject that I'm studying is my own practice. But it's of a particular kind of practice. It's the practice of asking questions and hypotheses and judgments. That's it seems to me what the three things we ask is what are we doing when we're asking a question? What is happening when we come to a suggestion, a theory, a suggestion? How do you judge the suggestion to be correct or incorrect? And sometimes, of course, you've already involved yourself morally because you've already involved yourself in doing this. You said this is worthwhile doing. But then sometimes very specifically we ask, not that, but we ask, what am I to do now? And that can be, and we're asking that all the time, but that's very particular. And then we will examine ourselves and say, how is it, as a matter of fact, that I respond to particular situations, the kind of response I give?
But is methodology how I ask questions, how I formulate hypotheses, and how I make judgments? Is that fundamentally
that's
what method is about?
Yes, it is.
Can we move towards the introspective methodology part of it more?
Yeah.
You have a sequence: experience, insight, judgment.
Yes.
Take us through it.
We take the example of the fork.
Yeah. You will experience using the fork.
Using the fork and seeing how people use it. When I was young, we used it always the way I suggested first in my culture. Going then to the continent, when I was 14 or something like that, I discovered another polite way of using the fork, which has come in now in Ireland. That was a common sense understanding, wasn't it? But it was an understanding. It was an understanding that this was not only done, but was accepted. It was an understanding of a tiny bit of another culture. Not very importantly different, but nonetheless different.
Right.
So you understand it not only as a practice, you understand it as a politeness.
Right, okay.
And then you might begin to try historically, and historically again is a curious kind of science because it's not, but it's asking, why is this the case? What therefore is the reality? The judgment, Connell's hypothesis is correct, is judged to be correct, is what we would say is true. That's the reality. But as Pierce said...
Right now we don't know that
Can you hold that now a second, the judgment stage, Garrett?
Yeah.
You've jumped now the insight stage. So now, is insight and understanding the same thing?
Insight gives you understanding.
Right, okay.
So an insight comes from testing your hypothesis and forming
no, that's the second insight. The first insight is you have the problem. Why do people use the fork? What way do they use the fork? So insight is the answer. Is the proposed answer to a question.
Yes.
Insight gives the proposed answer. Yeah. But the question.
But the real power is the question.
Is the real. It starts.
Yeah.
So somewhere in the mistiness or fuzziness of experience, a question occurs.
Yes.
And the insight is the proposed answer to that question, as you see it, right. Judgment.
Judgment then is when you have the proposed answer, and your question then is this proposed answer correct? Does it work? And we can see that arises because people can differ about the answer, can't they? About the suggestion. And so the question of judgment comes in where the question gives a suggested answer, a suggestion. And that suggestion may or may not be right. And we know that. Now, how do we know that? Because we have made mistakes. That's how you know that your solution is not always right. If you have never made a mistake, it would never occur to you.
Whether it's a right or wrong, you just think it is.
You just think it is. So that is clarifying what your data is, what your question is, and then your hypothesis about it. And then asking, is my hypothesis correct? And that ends up with what Peirce says, the provisional truth. This is the best available opinion.
You said it yourself there a minute ago, people are not inclined to ask questions.
Yeah.
Right.
And people are less and less inclined to ask questions because they're afraid.
Yes.
Right.
We could talk all night probably about the sources of all of that.
Yes.
Probably through...
Yeah, that has the thing running through everything you say, and I wonder, is that the occupational hazard of a philosopher, that you think everybody asks questions? A lot of people...
They don't.
You know, why would people take on the kind of development work we want to do with them and help them? Why would people do it? What brings them to it? And the trouble is, you know, there are people who do and they turn up, but...
One way, I go back to the figs.
Yeah.
And why did I count the figs? It isn't that I ask every possible question in the world. It's that it occurred to me that I wanted to know. So if you could bring to somebody, is there something you want to know about this area? And it's rare that people don't want to know anything. What is not rare is that they want a solution very immediately.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they don't want to ask a question. They want a solution to the question. And if you say, well, there's a way of finding a solution. I haven't done it. I haven't actually counted the things, but that's how you do it. And it might occur to them then that it was quite enjoyable. Maybe the sixth time trying to count them was less enjoyable. But we do, maybe it would be also to find out what did people that you're talking about, did they ask questions during the day that they didn't really think of as questions? It's not examining somebody else, it's examining yourself. And it's not examining, psychology is a huge set. This in a way is psychology to some extent. It's getting to know. But the crucial thing is that it's like exercises. That here we're asking questions about ourselves, asking questions. What is it to ask a question? And then we discover that you come up with an insight, a direct insight. This is what we do. And then we ask the next question, is it correct?
Yes.
And so it's always trying, and this whole very large book that Insight is, and this quite smaller book that this one is, it's really developing that.